Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Welcome also those who are joining us online. Welcome to the series of talks by Professor Bette Talvacchia. And this evening, it's the third talk called Variation. Bette?
Thank you. I'm my ex. Good evening, or whatever time of day it is for everyone online, welcome, and to all of my colleagues here. It is especially pleasurable to continue this series of talks this evening with my category of variation. And I think you'll find it's a very rich one. So what I'm going to do is give you lots and lots of information, because I would like that thesis that I have put into play about this alternate path of development of modernism to be supported by lots and lots of fantastic examples. So it might be a little bit frustrating that I'm going to say probably too little about a lot of artists, but it's, I hope, enough to just show you these examples. And then every artist I introduce could probably have, at minimum, an entire hour lecture, even at this point, about their work. So we're going to move through and have a look at a great variety, because the whole idea is when you can identify a specific work of art that the artist is conversing with, reacting to, engaging, or perhaps a theme from the Renaissance, where you know many examples and you see the 20th or 21st century artist having a dialogue with that theme. So we will start with getting this, I hope, correct again in terms of, yes, there's my written form of everything I just told you. And of course, very, very happy to be here at NIKI. So Paula Rego is the first artist I want to present this evening. She, as you, many of you already know, was Portuguese born and went to England, especially for art school. She went in 1952 to study at the Slade. And if you know something about Portuguese history, that of course was in the midst of the fascist Salazar regime. And that is something that was also part of her personal history, which she engaged in many ways in her art. What you see in front of you is a bit of this very monumental work of art that she created for the National Gallery in London. She was the first artist in residence there. When she was given the invitation, she said that she first turned it down. Maybe she was ready to turn it down, that she didn't know what would be good about engaging with all of this old master art. She thought, that's not something that I'm interested in. Now, that's a very good story, because in fact, she then said, yes, on second thought, I'll be that artist in residence. And you will see that she made very, very creative use of her time in many ways. So she created what you see there in the background, a multi-panel work called Crivelli's Garden. And she engaged the work of Carlo Crivelli, this Madonna delle Rondine, but not the major devotional image of the Infernal Madonna between saints in the altarpiece, but the predella panel, that narrow panel at the bottom of the altarpiece, divided into separate panels. And she essentially took the idea of the structuring of her space from that. But there are many other aspects of both Crivelli's art and other artists that you'll see as we move along. So there is a more targeted combination to show you her interest in the storytelling part of the altarpiece. And as those of us who work in Renaissance know, that was an area where narratives were engaged, where a lot of experiments with developing illusionistic space developed. And this is very fertile territory for a storyteller to look into. what Paula Rego said was, I love the stories and I want to undermine them. And I think that one very pithy statement tells you a lot about her art. The series of panels were placed in the dining room in the Sainsbury wing of the National Gallery in London. They were taken out and put on exhibition while that was all undergoing renovation, restoration, and I can't tell you right at the moment where these are, but we'll leave that a little mysterious, but think about these being in the restaurant. Okay, we get the next one up here. I'm going to focus on one panel to give you a closer view of what she did. Well, she told stories based on women's lives, from hagiography, from the lives of saints, from history, mythology, but also her personal memories. And as you move through those spaces that were helped to be structured by Carlo Crivelli, you see her making references to all of those aspects, historical and personal, plus other works of art. So I just looked at this as closely as I could, and the works that you see appended to that panel by Rego are none of them in the National Gallery, as a matter of fact, although she engaged some others there. But I wanted to show you the vastness of her sources and her interest, despite those disclaimers that she made. So if you look at Artemisia Gentileschi's, Judith and Holofernes, and you see that she made an encounter between two women, a young woman, a girl, and an older woman. They're looking inside something that visually refers to the decapitated head, but we don't know what's in there. So she leaves that open-ended. She uses as one of her dividers a Solomonic column that you can see, of course, in St. Peter's, but Raphael used them in his series of cartoons for the tapestries that we looked at last time. As we move along, there's Judith in action in the background there. The seated figure certainly makes reference to Durer's melancholy, and there is a figure referring to Donatello's Mary Magdalene. And I also want to point out the wonderful figure that is in the pose of the thinker, because one of the things that Rego did as she was putting this work together was to have different members of the staff of the National Gallery sit for her. And she had become friends with all members of the staff at every kind of capacity in making that wonderful museum run. And that central figure is based on Erica Langmuir, who for a long time was the head of education. And I want to point that out because she wrote a book that I think is still a fabulous guide to getting to know the National Gallery collection. It's the companion to the National Gallery collection that she wrote. So there she is, also immortalized by Paula Rego. And finally, I'm going to point out that she used another of Crivelli's works from the collection, and once more used it for its spatial structure. But interestingly, where Crivelli gives you an arch that leads back into deep space, she gives you an arch that's closed off, whereas the interior space that Crivelli constructs is somehow almost like a little pavilion. So she's going to play games with the kind of space that she creates and engages. And I point this out because, remember, there's always that statement that modernist artists, modern artists just get rid of Renaissance space. And that is one of the precepts for being a modern artist. And here you see that proved wrong. Finally, I couldn't help but point out the figure that she puts in the front, this young woman who is looking at the viewer. That's a good Albertian rule, that you have one figure turn around and engage the viewer. And that is a storyteller as well, with that book open in her lap. And of course, it's reminiscent to my eyes of Pontormo's Visitation, where a figure on the steps does the same thing. And of course, you just go down the road and you can have a great look at that, all of you who are sitting with me here. And Crivelli is an interesting example to choose because, as many of us know in our studies of Renaissance art, he is generally not included in not just the surveys, but even in more specialized Renaissance coursework in our programs, in part because he has really been pushed outside the canon, the famous canon that we always talk about, because he's so hard to fit into a smooth path of development. But his art is so full of visual interest, and many artists have acknowledged that. And Audrey Flack, whom you met last time, is one who tells us that she had first seen Crivelli at the Met, because she was an artist from New York, always, and based there, and was fascinated by him. And when she took a trip to London, she saw the Crivellis in the National Gallery. So I think it was 1980, 1981 that she took that trip, and she was already hooked on Crivelli. So when she finished having a look at the work, she went to the bookshop to try to find some information and reproductions to take back, to hold on to. And she found a book by a kind of catalog by a former director of the museum that was devoted to Crivelli's works, but really had terrible things to say about him, kind of dismissed him as someone who didn't fit into real Renaissance production because, again, he was just a little too out there for simply incorporating him into our straight line histories. So Audrey Flack said, you know, this is an artist for me. Now, not only did she go on to make works that are variations of Crivelli's compositions, but she, now listen to this, as an artist in 1981, published in Arts Magazine a piece saying, this is so wrong that the museum doesn't think highly of Carlo Crivelli. He said she took on, you know, an institution of great richness and standing and just went for it and defended Carlo Crivelli. So this is a wonderful thing. It was in Arts Magazine in 1981, if you want to track that down, and reprinted recently in a wonderful exhibition in the Icon Gallery in London. And they put it into their catalog where they talk about the illusionism of Crivelli. So I've got to move myself along here. Audrey Flack looked at the Madonna della Candeletta and this wonderful print by John Payne and put them together, and that is her title, the Madonna della Candeletta, and then in parentheses, someone in Brooklyn loves me. And of course, she was working in Brooklyn, and the person who loved her in Brooklyn, it was her husband sitting there with his T-shirt in back of the Madonna beside the skeleton. And again, if you look at that in detail, she's playing all kinds of interesting, serious games in dialogue with her models. So look at what happens to the skeleton leg that is detached from the skeleton itself and sits there in the hand, under the hand of Mary. So she wants you to do some close looking here. And here again is my point. If you only know Audrey Flack without knowing Carlo Crivelli, or without at least maybe looking up John Payne, another artist that's not a household word, you're going to miss a lot of the richness and a lot of the conversation that you can have with the art that you look at. Audrey Flack, who, as I mentioned, just died last June, described herself as a radically contemporary old mistress. Again, you know, we just have to take a moment to thank Audrey Flack for all of her words and all of her art. We're going to stay with Carlo Crivelli. I mean, can you believe it? Did you ever imagine that this group of artists were so enamored of his work, and not only that, but found all different ways to engage it? So here, Rakib Shah, who grew up in Kashmir and then went to London, I believe it was with his family, and he studied at Central St. Martin's School of Art and became then an artist who is bringing together Eastern and Western traditions from both of his identities and inheritances. So he also looked at Carlo Crivelli. Shaw looks a lot at the art in the National Gallery in London, as well as other places. He also used that structure, the architectural structure, the spatial setup of Crivelli's Annunciation, and filled it in a way that echoes the original composition, but with all different kinds of characters. Here's another artist that really wants you to look closely at his work. If you don't know his work yet, do get to know. He works with enamel paint that he mixes himself and has found a way of using material that creates outlines to hold the bits of enamel color, exquisite surfaces that have that jewel-like quality. And he revels in the richness of Crivelli's patterns, colors, and gives his own equivalents for them, taking lots of creatures that go through his fantasy, but from Indian traditions that he puts into these pieces that we see as Western art, and he makes something then entirely new and different. I'm going to let you see another of his works. Here he is looking at the Cupid Complaining to Venus by Lucas Cranach, and you can see from the date, this is an earlier work of his. This, I believe, is in the collection of Central St. Martin's, and that was something he did for, I think, his BFA. He also got his MFA there. So he, once more, is, by virtue of his studies, blending and calling upon different traditions. So with Cranach here, he gets rid of Cupid. That's an interesting thing. And again, if you go back and think about the original and see what's kept, what's changed. So in some ways, it doesn't make it Venus anymore, because her attribute that identifies her has been taken away. Something to think about, why that was good for his pictorial purposes. So you have now a pink-skinned woman whose hat goes very nicely. It's almost as though she's wearing a kind of costume of nudity. That is such a wonderful concept, comes from a colleague talking about that in a totally different situation. But notice that in the Cranach, those fantastic accessories that Venus is wearing really give a kind of spicy note to her nudity, right? And what Shaw does, I think, visually, by just using more fantasy in the coloration, then he gives a totally different effect. That kind of patterning that he uses, again, taken from Indian and Asian traditions, and then mixed with what he's seeing in Cranach's art. And we'll just engage one more of Shaw's works, where he shows you the Kashmir Danaya after Gosar. Again, all that is in his title, and I put it beside the original Danaya of Jan Gosar. And here, again, if you start looking into what's taken over, in addition to that fantastic setting that Shaw makes the most of, the golden light from the myth of Jupiter and Danae is transformed into something that is much more vivid in its coloration. And if you look closely, it is, there are like sparks and fire, which then relate and pull your eye back to a building that's on fire in the background. And that is making a reference to something in history that happened in his lifetime. The Sufi shrine of the Dastgir Sahib, a very sacred shrine in Srinagar, where he grew up. It was the site of battles and atrocities in the 1990s. And in 2012, it was gutted by fire. but the relics that were contained in it were saved. They were in a fireproof container. So the shrine was rebuilt, and I think still is a very important religious center. So he can think through events and use the knowledge and conversation with older art to think of great ways of representing that. And the blue figure in the center, if you're wondering, that is a self-portrait. He often does put himself into his compositions. And here he took up that note of blue from Gosar, and he tells us that this is a reference to the Hindu god Krishna, known for compassion and love. And that color blue apparently is associated with Krishna. So the more you know about both of the traditions, the more you're going to be able to understand what Rakib Shah is inviting you to think about and meditate on. And as we're thinking about this strategy of mixing not only different traditions, but your personal history or experience or modern history that touches you very deeply, we can think of a very different artist, Bob Thompson, an American artist who was working in the 1960s and died a tragically young death. He wasn't even 30. He died, in fact, in Rome because in the first years of the 60s, he left the States to come to Italy, where he then encountered art that made an enormous impact on him. And of course, he was an artist who was trained in American schools, and so already had that association with the Western tradition through the art schools that he studied in, and then came to Italy and experienced it firsthand. But as you see, he made his own variations on very specific compositions. He, like Philip Guston, was quite a fan of Piero della Francesca. And as you might think of the last time people in here went down the road to have a look at it in the Uffizi, the next time you see it, you'll have more ideas and thoughts to bring to it, because Thompson saw these Renaissance compositions and his association as an artist with these old masters as a vehicle for talking about his own life and experiences in heroic terms, nothing less than that. And so he takes over Piero's composition. It's the allegorical triumph of the Duke, Federico da Montefeltro. So here, I would say that Thompson is giving us a symbolic self-portrait as he takes the place of the Duke, and his brown skin in real life is made more intense here in a red-brown color. So I think he's being specific at the same time that he is sort of reveling in the fauve technique, which he does with the seated figures in that triumphal chariot. And you'll see that Thompson is also very much having a wonderful time in thinking through his artistic heritage as he uses it for this serious purpose. He is also in a teasing dialogue, talks back to it a little bit sometimes. So you can see that in the allegory of triumph, of course, you have a winged figure in the Christian tradition, an angel taken over from the ancient winged figures of victory. And there we have the Renaissance engaging the past. What Thompson does is make it into a winged bird. And he developed his own system of symbols in which birds had a big part to play as you look at his work. So not only do you have that bird, at the end of the chariot, what of course the winged victory is doing is crowning Federico. The figures that you see here, so, dust off your Renaissance iconography, because you have 4 figures whose attributes tell us that they are the cardinal virtues. So again, the Christian culture of the time is allegorizing the virtues that, of course, the ruler has, right? So again, make that movement then ahead in time to Bob Thompson putting himself into the chariot, the carol with all of the virtues. And you've got justice facing front with the sword and scales. You're going to have to, get really close to this and you'll set off alarms in the Uffizi, but that's okay. And don't get too close. Then you have prudence and profile with her mirror. You have fortitude, and take a good look at fortitude. Where's my arrow here? Yeah, there's fortitude with the broken column. And with her back to us, because remember, of course, personifications are always female. So with her back to us is temperance. And as you look at Thompson's figures, again, there are all kinds of colors. So again, we're talking about issues of race where all kinds of colors appear. And also, I want you to see, look at the figure that has the place of fortitude in Thompson's composition, because, lost my arrow, she is holding a tree. Now, I'm not sure what that meant in Thompson's personal symbolism, but what he did visually, again, I just see this, he's laughing a little bit and reading that column as the stem of this, what is a hill, but he translates that into a tree over in his composition. Changes, of course, the white horses into black ones, and again, wants you to think about the changes. Something that Thompson said that I love is apropos of his palettes, and he says, volcanically hot and fluorescently cool, I'm doomed to be buried alive in cadmium orange, red, yellow light with flowers on my grave of magenta violet. And that was quoted in an exhibition recently at the Michael Rosenfeld Gallery, who has represented his estate and letting us see all of these great works. So he is connected to modernism through fauve palettes, and of course, all of the history that I've given you a hint about. And I'm dwelling on this one because, I saw this in another exhibition where and it was a wonderful exhibition, but it simply said based on a Renaissance prototype. And I thought, oh, wow, look at what's missing. Maybe that particular curator wasn't aware of this specific work, but there are ways of finding it out. None of us know everything, but the public should be told as much as possible to help really connect with these things. So that's what happens again when you take that time. It's really rewarded. And here's another of Bob Thompson's, now using a very well-known image of Masaccio's expulsion from Paradise, and again, very emotional color is being used there. And he, taking up what Masaccio did, I was trying to remind myself, actually quite closely in the male figure, where again, here's a gender issue that I always bring up about this painting by Masaccio. How do Adam and Eve show their shame after sinning? Well, the male covers his face, it's intellectual, right? And he's got this very athletic and noble body that no one at the very start of the existence of this painting had trouble that this was in a chapel. And it was such a strong representation of that, athlete of virtue who understands his sinning. And what does Eve do? She covers her sexuality. So for her, the sin is one always, for women, it's connected to chastity rather than anything intellectual. And that is a very important gender issue to think about in Renaissance art. And look what Bob Thompson does. He doesn't follow that in his representation of the woman. So more to think about. One more by Bob Thompson, which I just think, again, it shows, he was friends with a lot of jazz musicians, and the kind of rhythm in the jazz that he was listening to had an impact on his art. And that he can, of course, show you rhythms with color patterns, with movement of the figures. And I just love how in his encounter with Titian, Andromeda is kind of dancing there in the foreground for us because she's not chained down. And as Perseus comes to save her, I mean, he looks like he's taking a nosedive into the monster in the water, and he is holding one of Thomson's birds. So you get to see, I'm not sure that he wanted us to understand all of his personal bits, but by repetition, you start getting a feel for them. And as I say, he is absolutely consciously putting this together because it's all, you know, he owns it all, which is really exciting. And that before he died in, I think it was 1966, about 29, maybe not even quite 29. So here's another way of then giving dignity to personal experiences and to groups of people who have been marginalized or not incorporated into the canon of art yet. And so Kehinde Wiley, and whom we've met and we'll see a few more times because his corpus is so full of these ideas. He traveled to Tahiti and got to know a community of Mehu who are understood as a third gender in Polynesian culture. They are treated with respect. They have a very particular place throughout Polynesian culture. It varies from place to place. And I can only tell you this very little bit of it that I'm still learning about. But when Wiley showed these works for the first time, it was, to my knowledge, in a gallery in Paris, the Templon. And he was specifically creating a polemic with the very well-known images that Paul Gauguin made of Tahitians, where there's been a lot of studies about the objectification of these people and how he treated them. And Wiley then wants to give a different status to this community. And how does he do it? Well, with Wiley's knowledge of Renaissance art and his love for it, he poses one of these, the Mehu, I would say as a Madonna. I mean, look at it visually. The designs that we've seen before that Wiley uses to make that patterned background, to have that disjunction, and yet it works, the volume of the figure, the patterns that at times come around and engulf them, as it does in this portrait. And that is similar to the cloth of honor that's often held behind the seated Madonnas. And it is a pose of importance, of dignity. And if you know the reference, you understand very clearly that this is being transferred to the figures that Wiley is painting. Look at the gesture that Moirai Mantuani, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, but empty hands. Look at the very expressive hands of Carlo Crivelli's Madonna, and holding the child, right? So again, why? What does Wiley want us to think of as we see that very expressive gesture, but absolutely nothing there? Well, we're going to look at these things back and forth just for a moment. As you look at Fra Angelico's figure of Mary, up to about this point, you'd imagine she's kneeling, but she's not, because she's holding the child across her thighs. And so we've got another formation right here. Again, if you block off the top of that painting and just look at the shapes that Fra Angelico makes down there, okay, this is abstraction from the human figure for compositional purposes. We read that without any trouble as a child being held on this woman's lap. But you try to make anatomical sense of that, and it's not there. So we can't always imagine that this is only working one way, in the sense that look at some of the abstractions of the figure that Renaissance masters engaged in, and there's a lot of visual excitement in that as well. once more with Kehinde Wiley, as he, we would say, maybe interrogates these paintings from the past. Holbein's Dead Christ, Wiley takes over that composition and puts a young African American there, poses him exactly in the same way, but with a different set of startling results. Whereas there's no doubt at all that Christ is dead in the Holbein painting. That young man in Wiley's painting looks at us, right? His mouth is open like Christ's mouth. Christ's eyes are semi-closed, but that head is tilted just a little bit more in Wiley's version, so it confronts us. And it does, of course, tell us to think about the number of young Black men who die in American culture and around the world, violence that is visited upon them. He is certainly, the young man in Wiley's painting is on what we would say, a slab with a winding cloth on it. So death is present. But look at the difference in the spatial construction, where Holbein's Christ, there is literally no room to breathe because that figure is not breathing anymore. Wiley gives him a bit more, right? It's not so claustrophobic. And so that ambiguity is to get us thinking about these issues that the painting will bring up. It is, the Holbein's painting, as many of you know, is life-size. Wiley's is even more monumental. I noted down it is 144 inches long, that is to say about 12 feet. So we've got super monumental in that example. And as I think most of you will remember from the wonderful publicity or informational images that NIKI has put out that have been so wonderful, that here is one where Wiley's young man and Andrea Mantegna's Dead Christ, where Wiley, again, lamentation over the dead Christ, he refers to the original composition, and they can be visually joined by the viewer. And again, you take over the power of these older images and you translate it into a modern idiom, and you get just as much power there. So as we're thinking about these dead figures, let's have a quick look at Kerry James Marshall again and look at his beauty examined. So remember that what Marshall does is he uses that really opaque, I think it's an ivory black, if I'm not mistaken, to make the point about the Black bodies that he's dealing with. And not only does he refer to Mantegna, but he refers to Rembrandt. And as that one arm has been, the skin has been pulled off to study the musculature. Here again, we have a clear statement about skin deep, about the color of the skin, about skin being a surface and so forth. And then the canons of beauty are relative to time and place. And so there's a lot of visual information, not to neglect, of course, some Black faces and halos, where Marshall is making explicit references and statements for the viewer to think about and we hope act upon. So if those are canons, if we're speaking of canons of beauty, then it's great to take a moment to look at what Jenny Saville does with the female figure. And she is a painter who revels in the materiality of oil paint, and she uses it to express a particular view of often of flesh, and particularly of women's bodies, that so you're looking at this, if you're not yet conversant with her art, it is very polemic in terms of, do we want to revel in the messiness of human flesh, or do we want to show idealized figures to send a positive message? So here again, there's lots of tough issues to think about, but I would say that Saville absolutely was thinking about Michelangelo's heroic ignudi, that twisting back is a variation of one of Michelangelo's sort of master touches. I show you a drawing, I show you a figure from the Sistine, and one of the wonderful things about that painting juncture is that it is also monumental. So here you see some installation shots, two of them from the LGDR gallery in New York in 21, as it was then. And really, you walked up that staircase, you know, right past it, and it had the impact that Michelangelo's nudes have, but not idealized, not heroic, and female instead of male. So I just made a little montage of different reactions to that. The Telegraph, you know, having this one very diminutive female figure, dark against the expanse of that back. And so again, this is something that is meant to really hit you. And one of the things that Saville says, I just try to give you a quote whenever I can. She says, "I paint flesh because I'm human. Flesh is just the most beautiful thing to paint." So there you have everything, you know, in terms of what do we accept as beautiful. And are women's bodies really forced into very narrow concepts of beauty? Well, of course they are. So she's making us think about that too. All right, another way of thinking about bodies is by looking at the tradition of Saint Sebastian, who, you know, his history and even his martyrdom is much more complicated than just arrows going into him, because in fact he survived that and was actually martyred in a different way, but we almost never hear that part of the story. But his moment of showing his faith and his decision to be a martyr is represented by his body being pierced by arrows. And an artist named Michael Richards took up that idea. And as we say, I'm going to get you closer to that figure, but instead of arrows, for his explicit reference to Saint Sebastian, Tar Baby versus Saint Sebastian, two different figures that are referred to in the sculpture that he made. That body is pierced by airplanes, and I'll show you that a little bit more closely. That number of airplanes is actually something that you can find in examples. It's not as common in the Renaissance tradition, but the hagiography says there were so many arrows shot into Sebastian, he looked like a porcupine. So this is a more accurate rendition of the text that we have for Sebastian. And what Michael Richards did was to start with a cast of his own body, because he is thinking about very specific issues of, if you want to call it martyrdom in the present day. These planes and the uniform that he puts on his figure, that is both him and not him, refers to a battalion of airmen from Tuskegee, Alabama. They were a battalion distinguished for their contribution. Many of their planes were shot down. And he did a series of works that were based on the history of this group. He was a Brooklynite of Jamaican and Costa Rican ancestry. And I'm speaking of him most unfortunately in the past tense, because in the midst of his thoughts about flight and bodies being shot down, he was working on his art in the World Trade Center on 9/11 and was killed by the terrorist attack of planes into the building. And it does make you shiver when you hear this story. So Michael Richards was becoming very well known, and you can see his art is extremely powerful. And that was, this is what he's left us. So luckily we have some of his work, but his fate was to die in a way that was closely related to themes that he was pursuing in his art. And his was certainly a heroic body. And here's another one of our heroes, I think, from the last couple of talks, Jacob Lawrence, who made drawings after Vesalius. I must say, I only learned this fairly recently, and I was astounded that Lawrence, in 2 different phases, very intensely looked at Vesalius and drew new variations of those figures. And as you look closely at Lawrence's version, you see that he is doing a very modernist thing of making gestural additions in there that have nothing to do with real anatomy, but they are powerful signs that he was exploring. So I show you one study against the original. Here's a group of different works of variations that Lawrence carried out. I saw some of them very recently at the DC Moore Gallery, and I mention that because they were really helpful about a book that had been published on this and exhibitions that they've had. And it's very, very exciting to see him working through this and finding all sorts of, again, modernist, non-anatomical ways. I'm trying to get the arrow. You know, I love to run over to the board, but then I leave a hole in the middle of the recording. There it is. So have a look right there at that passage of just shapes inside the thigh. And eventually what Lawrence did, in addition to the studies, was to use some of these figures in many different media in a series about builders. And I show you a lithograph and gouache on paper. He was particularly proud of the contribution that African Americans made in a lot of these jobs of, literally building things, construction, carpentry, different manual crafts. And he really celebrated those achievements through the use of the Vesalian figures. Okay, Kirby, close your eyes for a second, because the next slide is going to take you right back to the heart of the Renaissance after we've been with Lawrence. And here I'm just again showing something that, is really part, I would say, general common culture, this idea of the 3 graces and the many, many versions from the Renaissance. And then, of course, the Renaissance already looking back to the classical world for this particular combination of 3 female figures, right? The canonical one is to have one of the figures facing back and all of them linked. Botticelli made his variation of the dancers. Raphael in the Farnesina makes it part of the Cupid and Psyche story. And here, I think famously through drawings, he used one model posed in different ways, and then a very classicizing version that Raphael made. And where do we go with that? Well, here's something really wonderful. Barclay Hendricks, again, we're now starting to see more of the work of these artists that have been introduced a few times. He did a nice gender switch on one of his versions of the 3 graces with one of his friends. And he was always, Hendricks was always very specific about these very stylish outfits that his subjects wore. And I particularly love those, I don't know, the spectator shoes, the 2-tone shoes that are being worn. So this is very detailed, but it's that figure, of course, shown in the composition of the 3 graces. And then he does it with a female subject. She's shown 3 times. And he again shows you the details of that particular person and what she looks like, how she's dressed, but then also moves into abstraction in that very strong contrast of her glowing skin, dark skin, black hair, and the white, both of her outfit and the ground that she's standing on. So new variations on the 3 graces. And Kehinde Wiley also, as you can imagine, took up this theme. He shows you these young women in street attire. They have their hip hop clothes on and they are looking great, and they are surrounded by that floral ground, which also becomes part of the foreground, which envelops them. So this is Wiley. Yeah, I think I didn't put that. I think around 22, that is. It's a fairly recent one. Sorry, I don't have that right to hand. But the point I want to make, more than the pedantic one, is he started expanding his work to do women's subjects, because his earlier work was strictly male subjects. And the first series that he did with women as subjects was a series on Judith, and that was 2012. It was an exhibition called Economy of Grace at the Sean Kelly Gallery. And I, manipulated your view of this by showing you Donatello's Judith in its surroundings in the Palazzo Vecchio, because you have that great fleur-de-lis environment for it, which works so well with the setting that Kehinde Wiley has painted for his Judith. And there is, of course, a strong polemic punch in Wiley's work, because he has this woman holding the head. I would say it's hard to tell the gender of that figure. We're going to say maybe it's non-binary. It perhaps is male. The fact is, it's a studio assistant who, with good grace, I would say, had his portrait done as their portrait done as the decapitated head. And I want to remind everyone that Donatello's work was just as polemic when he, for his own society, or just slightly later, because remember, we have those notes from the meeting where all of the artists and city officials were debating where to place Michelangelo's statue of David. And in the course of the discussion, one of the members of that committee said about Donatello's, it is really not a good thing that we have as a symbol a woman subjugating a man. So the gender issue was right back there, right at the start of these monumental versions of Judith, and Wiley picks that up. And this is really for another moment, but to say there is this very interesting history in the early modern tradition of women having their portraits done as Judith, and in one case that we know about, a husband commissioning a painting of his dead wife as Judith with his head as the decapitated Holofernes. So once more, we have great interpretations, and we had great polemic ones in the Renaissance as well. All right, speaking of common ground, have a look at these portraits, talking now about these individuals who, Winold Reiss, remember the German artist who emigrated to New York and became part of the Harlem Renaissance. And he made a portrait of two public school teachers, which I see as very close to Pontormo's portrait of two friends. Remember that Reiss was trained in the academies of Europe and knew his art history extremely well. And for these two young women who are school teachers, there is again that emphasis on, is more, I think, for Reiss's version, what's going on up here. They're pensive, they're thinking, they're sharing some material that maybe they've been discussing. I don't want to make my own narrative about it, but we're found an open book that they're glancing up from. And they are as simply and almost starkly dressed as Pontormo's gentlemen. And we know that that kind of simplicity, and certainly in the Renaissance, that expensive black cloth was for upper classes. It's a sense of not only elegance, but of status. And I think these two young women have been given that by Reiss, probably had it in real life. And it features the one adornment, which are those, I don't think they're chains, but let's say, whoops, over on this side, the necklaces that they're wearing, they are both wearing Phi Beta Kappa keys. So these are accomplished young women who have been made members of that honor society that exists in the States. So not only are they shown as thinkers, but tell me if that's, overreaching. I think that the enjoy that aspect, which I think has had too much dispute in Renaissance art. These two angels are thinking about the incarnation. That's what's being shown to us. And Raphael had that touch with these little putti of making them totally engaging, and that's to get us into the painting. They're just thinking about how could the incarnation happen. And Rice, in my opinion, takes that over for, again, just endowing these two women with as much status as the old masters can give them. So a wonderful rendition. Okay, something where it's a little bit more, what shall we say, less idealized perhaps. In Alfred Leslie's work, The Birthday Party for Ethel Moore, where he looks to Caravaggio for, of course, those contrasts of light and dark, the chiaroscuro, that he uses in such a powerful way. And we're told it's a birthday party, therefore you think you're looking at a cake with candles in the middle, but he shows you nothing in the center there, except I was trying to look really closely at that earlier. There is a candle or a match right there that maybe that hand has lit. So there is that tiny little light source. But to my eyes, there's the birthday cake down there without any candles. So he's playing a visual game with you. And again, quoting this figure straight from Caravaggio, but where Caravaggio's great thing was to have that hole in the elbow come right out at you from that, almost as though that happened when this fellow was so forcefully pushing back in surprise. And he tames that gesture. He cites it, but tames and pushes that figure back into the plane. So once more, I'm imagining he wants you to know what source it is that he's talking back to. And Leslie became perhaps most famous for this kind of a so-called photorealist style, but he started as an abstract painter. He then began making films, most famously with Robert Frank, and from that started thinking about the power of light and dark and figures moving around in your compositional space, and then developed this photorealist style. So here's his take on the Mary Magdalene. And I love this because this young woman who's not named, the instant pictures, most of you won't even know, they're Polaroids, right? So that was a big technology that you could shoot something in the camera you're holding and pull it out all developed, usually not so great, right? But immediately. So it's an instant picture. That was new technology at that point. And we have a young woman meditating on the photos that she's looking at. What is it that she's remembering there? So that kind of meditation now is for, in a modern way, aspects of her life, but similar to the way that Mary Magdalene in that earlier Christian tradition was meditating upon her sins or the kind of life that she had been living. Who knows, the modern young woman might be doing that as well. But there is the reference to get you thinking about those sorts of issues and really showing, hey, I can do that kind of very snazzy light and dark composition as well and make it very effective. Okay, well, I'm just again going to sort of take up another theme now with Beatrice Caracciolo, an Italian artist from, I believe, grew up in Naples, who's now working in Paris. And she often engages these conversations with historical art. And her preferred medium is paper. And she does all kinds of expressive things with it, not to mention the very expressive gestures that she uses in composing her compositions. So here she's taking over Peter Bruegel's composition of The Blind Leading the Blind. Pardon my English for my pronunciation, as we do in English, of the painter's name, but in compensation, I have put the Dutch title, which is sometimes used. Also to remind me to say that this is a parable. Right? We just talk about blind leading the blind. It is very symbolic, but it's a parable with a moralizing point. It's a story. So we're back to that desire for narration and what you can get with telling these stories. Caracciolo, I think, wants us to think about, perhaps, shall we say, world leaders at the moment when we think about this. She, from a statement that I read, was also very impressed with Bruegel's specificity in each of the faces of the men afflicted with different illnesses that cause them to lose their sight. So the non-sighted, not as just a generic thing, but as something very specific, and their etiology of the illnesses that was being explored. So Caracciolo takes these ideas and thinks, again, has this interaction with the historical art to think through both her own way of expressing these thoughts and getting us to think about them. And her work is so interesting that I just put a little montage of installation shots from an exhibition devoted to the different versions of this work in the Paula Cooper Gallery. And let me see what I can tell you. Caracciolo says, "I love using paper. I like the way it resists tools and the possibility of erasing, wetting, sometimes even submerging the entire artwork in water. It is a technique that creates layers that are imperceptible in photos." So this is also, go see the real work if you want all of the visual interest. But in person, you can see all the passages through which a work has passed and so forth. Okay, going to move, jumping to another work of graphic art in every sense. All right, there's the sequence from Caracciolo, Giulio Romano in the 16th century, making a series of scandalous works showing heterosexual couples in the midst of their lovemaking, the act of making love. And there is, of course, a whole history around that, which has been engaging for a lot of modern and contemporary artists, and even early modern ones. Two versions, I can't go into the whole history of it, but it's a fascinating one where the artist is also showing you something that is naughty, but he's having a lot of fun doing it. Look at the confusion of limbs on these two figures, echoed by the knot and the twisting drapery, the antique herms that are looking on. They're looking enviously because you notice that their members are missing. So you get all kinds of games of voyeur. We, of course, are voyeurs by looking at this series. So Giulio is teasing us along with showing off his ability as a draftsman. And Pietro Aretino was so taken with these images that he wrote sonnets to go along with them. They're even raunchier than the images. And then a real character, Frédéric Maximilien de Waldeck, in the 18th century, made his variations on the 16 positions. They were always called that. He made 20 just to amplify, shall we say. So a first wave feminist, Joyce Kozloff, we saw some of her work before. She, in the 1980s, thought that she would attack the issue of pornography. And there was a moment when there was a thought, if women take control of it, does it neutralize it? Does it make it okay? I think that thought came and went pretty quickly, as generally one of the definitions of pornography is that it's exploitative of the subject. But at that moment, when there was a first attempt in art of modern times to think that through, she thought, well, what about if you make it decorative? And this was a many-faceted challenge, because she, along with Mimi Shapiro, were pushing back at the kind of art criticism that said, that's girly stuff, if it's pattern, if it's decorative, if it's pretty colors. So they purposely used pattern and ornament in their works to reclaim it. And she thought maybe she'd do that. So she made Pornament, as you see, in her title. And here's where she's using some of the Giulio Romanos. I show you a detail. The classical stations were her ode to Hollywood, she said, in 1930s films. So have a good look at Joyce Kozloff if you want to see more variations on art from all over the world through that, trying to think through issues in pornography, not to mention then ornament and women's art. So that's still getting artists interested. An artist, Italian-American artist by the name of Francesca Strada, working in a studio in Brooklyn, has taken up this game, let's say, serious art game with Giulio Romano, thinking about these couples and studying Giulio's compositions, taking it over quite successfully, I think, where she is again showing us, what happens in this act of coupling where you can't tell whose foot, whose leg, and so forth. Those two heads coming together. Here's another version of Giulio Romano's where it's almost a cubist face, right? The way the nose and the mouth come together. So she thinks about that. She has her cupids holding cell phones. So she's not making this seamless. I am talking today. And I have had the pleasure of meeting Francesca, and I asked her about the color, and she said, yes, I put it in a landscape with toxic color because I'm concerned about issues of the environment. And this is a way of putting these figures from art history into nature and thinking through that issue. She also made a little tabernacle to hold another version of Giulio's figures and surrounds them with vegetation as well as the cupid that's coming at them. And when you close it, right, there was a tradition, of course, in the past, if you had this very strong subject matter, you might cover it with a curtain, you might close it off so that it could not be indiscriminately viewed. And she gives us that option as well. Another way of taking on historical art, Devin Shimoyana has decided that historical art is a way of thinking through and making statements about his identity as a gay man. If you know the story of Ganymede, Jupiter or Jupiter's eagle took him away to the heavens to be the cupbearer to the gods. And that has often been, of course, interpreted as a homosexual rapture of Jupiter's, who loved both sexes as much as possible. So Devin takes that over and says, I'm going to again now think of this human being who maybe doesn't fit easily into any category. There's all kinds of colors in his skin. It's interesting to me that the talons of the eagle in Shimoyama's work are not quite as nasty as they were in Michelangelo's or the copies after him. Something to think about. And in general, Shimoyama uses a lot of decorative materials, glitter, for example, and I think that as an analogy to gold leaf and mosaics that we were thinking about last time. In a number of artists' works, they use little rhinestones or glitter to, again, create this otherworldly environment and a glamorous one. He does talk about glamour in his work. Gold leaf kind of updated as glitter. He talks about using glitter and self-adornment to create a persona of importance. So once more, a community that at times is not welcome, is not thought highly of, and to reclaim some of that in the imagery that you make. The last artist I'm going to introduce you to is Harmonia Rosales. She is an American artist working in Chicago. She has a very rich ancestry, and I'm going to mention it because it is part of the imagery in her art. On her mother's side, she's Jewish and Jamaican, and on her father, she's Afro-Cuban, and she's an American from Chicago. So at different moments, she might focus on different parts of her cultural and personal heritage, but her particular love in art is for what we call the old masters, for historical art, and she particularly loves Michelangelo. But you see that her investigations range far and wide. So her Ganymede, the induction of Ganymede, comes from Gustave Le Sueur, and a close transposition of that with the very significant, two significant differences of her personages. The Black woman is, as defined by the artist, Mother Africa, and she is being taken away by the bald eagle, which of course symbolizes America. So very strong imagery. She, apropos of Renaissance art, says, I love this. This is what I'm drawn to. And everyone was telling me, especially the art world, don't do this. This is not going to sell. Nobody buys this stuff anymore. And she says, then Rosales, it's interesting that these works of art that are said to be the most beautiful works of art, the most priceless, they say it's out of fashion. But I have to do what I love, or else I feel I can't paint. I feel like my talent's not there. So she pushes forward, and I want to show you something fantastic that she came up with. This I have only seen in the photos that you're going to see. She rethinks Michelangelo and, of course, makes the gender changes. And I mentioned her ancestry because her father's people came from Yoruba, and they had a group of deities that they transformed into saints in order to be able to continue their devotions through the diaspora. When they were enslaved, when they were taken away from their homeland, they brought these saints with them, but turned them into analogies with the Christian saints so that they could continue without persecution, let's say. So that is something that Harmonia has thought about. And in addition to changing race and gender of the heroic figures that Michelangelo painted, she had the amazing idea of creating this installation by creating the hull of what represents a slave ship, inverting it, and putting inside a version of the structure of the Sistine ceiling with, of course, all of her figures. And I believe the way she did this, because as I say, I'm reading this, I would love to see this. I mean, there were a few exhibitions, so there is a small catalog of her work, but that she had her images fabricated, and then these were stretched, and I believe she might have painted over it, but a complex process for a fantastic result. And I want to leave you with this image. Again, just to say, just like the artist said, you know, it's like, so there, anyone who thinks that there isn't still vitality in engaging historical art. So thank you for the time.